She stood at the mirror, applying lipstick with a hand that trembled slightly, not from age but from anticipation. Margaret Harrison, at 52, had convinced herself that romance was a chapter permanently closed in her life story. The silver threads woven through her auburn hair told tales of wisdom earned, while the fine lines around her eyes mapped years of laughter and tears. Yet tonight, she was preparing for a date that defied every assumption she'd made about herself and the rigid boundaries society had drawn around her heart. The man waiting for her at the restaurant was 28. Thomas Chen had walked into her art gallery 3 months ago. Not as a casual browser, but as someone genuinely captivated by the Renaissance collection she'd curated. Their conversations had started professionally, evolved into friendship, and then crossed into territory that terrified her. Margaret had spent 2 decades building walls after her divorce, convincing herself that security and independence mattered more than the vulnerability of connection. She'd watched friends remarry, had politely declined countless setups, and had made peace with a life measured in professional achievements rather than romantic milestones. Her daughter was grown, her career flourishing, her retirement accounts healthy. What more could she possibly need? But Thomas had looked at her not with the polite interest of someone humoring an older woman, but with genuine fascination. He asked about her thoughts, her experiences, her dreams she'd never spoken aloud. He made her laugh in ways she'd forgotten were possible, and when he'd asked her to dinner, using the word date with deliberate clarity, something long dormant had stirred awake inside her chest. Now, as she grabbed her keys and headed toward the door, Margaret Harrison was about to discover that love doesn't consult calendars, doesn't respect age gaps, and certainly doesn't fade simply because we expect it to. Some stories don't end, they simply pause, waiting for the courage to begin again. Margaret arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early, a habit from her corporate days that she'd never quite shaken. The establishment was sophisticated without being pretentious, the kind of place where soft jazz floated between tables and candlelight made everyone look like they had secrets worth keeping. She'd chosen a dress that split the difference between trying too hard and not trying at all. A burgundy wrap dress that her daughter had insisted made her look absolutely radiant. When Thomas walked through the door, her breath caught in a way that felt both thrilling and slightly ridiculous. He wore a charcoal suit with an ease that suggested comfort rather than costume. And his smile when he spotted her carried relief, as though he'd been worried she might not show. As he approached the table, Margaret realized with startling clarity that she wasn't the only one who'd been nervous about this evening. Their greeting was awkward in the sweetest way, a brief embrace that lasted a half-second too long, followed by the comedy of both trying to sit simultaneously. Thomas knocked over the menu, Margaret laughed too loudly, and suddenly the tension dissolved like sugar in warm tea. This was real, this was happening, and perhaps most surprisingly, this felt natural despite every reason it shouldn't. As they ordered wine and perused menus they barely read, Margaret found herself studying Thomas with new eyes. She'd known him for months now, had memorized the way his hands moved when he explained something he was passionate about, had noticed how he listened with his entire attention rather than waiting for his turn to speak. But sitting across from him in this context, with intention declared and possibility hovering between them like a question, everything felt simultaneously familiar and brand new. The age difference that had consumed her thoughts all week seemed less significant now, sitting in his actual presence. Yes, they'd grown up with different technology, different music, different cultural reference points. But did that matter when the conversation flowed like water, finding its level? Did it matter when he looked at her like she was the most interesting person in the room? Margaret picked up her wineglass and met Thomas's eyes across the table. "I have to confess," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I almost canceled 3 times today." His laugh was warm, without judgment. "Only 3, he replied. "I'm at 7 and counting." And with that honest exchange, their evening truly began, carrying them both toward a future neither had planned, but both were brave enough to explore. 3 months earlier, Margaret had been arranging a new installation of Caravaggio reproductions when she'd first noticed Thomas. The gallery attracted many visitors, but most moved through with the hurried appreciation of tourists checking boxes. This young man, however, had stood before the calling of St. Matthew for nearly 20 minutes, his expression shifting between contemplation and something approaching reverence. As the gallery director and owner, Margaret prided herself on reading her visitors. The art world had taught her to distinguish genuine appreciation from pretentious performance. Thomas's engagement was unmistakably authentic. He leaned in to study brushwork, stepped back to consider composition, and moved with the careful reverence of someone who understood he was in the presence of something meaningful, even if these were reproductions. Professional curiosity had prompted her to approach him. "The use of light is remarkable, isn't it?" she'd offered, standing a respectful distance away. Thomas had turned, surprised but not startled, and his face had lit with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for children in toy stores. "It's revolutionary," he'd responded. "The way Caravaggio uses darkness not as absence but as a character in itself. It makes the light feel almost divine." That conversation had lasted 45 minutes, spanning artists from Rembrandt to contemporary photographers who played with similar chiaroscuro techniques. Margaret found herself energized in a way her usual gallery interactions rarely provided. Thomas wasn't trying to impress her with name-dropping or academic credentials. He was simply passionate, articulate, and genuinely curious about her perspective. She learned he was a software developer by profession, but an art history enthusiast by passion. He'd grown up in San Francisco, studied computer science at Berkeley, but had taken every art elective available. His apartment, he'd admitted with slight embarrassment, was covered with prints and postcards from museums he'd visited around the world. Art was his escape from the logical, binary world of code. When he'd asked if the gallery offered any lecture, series, or discussion groups, Margaret had found herself inviting him to a small gathering she hosted monthly for serious collectors and enthusiasts. She'd told herself it was purely professional networking. He was clearly knowledgeable and would add interesting perspectives to the conversation. The fact that his smile made her feel something she couldn't quite name was irrelevant. Thomas had attended that first discussion group and every subsequent one. He asked thoughtful questions, listened more than he spoke, and demonstrated a depth of understanding that impressed the other attendees, many of whom were decades older and career art professionals. Margaret noticed he often stayed after to help her rearrange chairs and lock up, their conversations extending into the parking lot under streetlights. Somewhere between the third and fourth meeting, Margaret realized she'd started choosing her outfits with more care on discussion group nights. She'd begun looking forward to Tuesdays with an anticipation that felt both wonderful and dangerous. At 52, she knew better than to develop a crush, especially on someone young enough to be her son. Yet there it was, undeniable and growing. The way her heart rate increased when he walked through the gallery doors, the way she found herself mentioning articles or exhibitions she thought he'd enjoy, the way his presence had become the highlight of her carefully constructed, perfectly controlled week. The shift from professional acquaintance to something more had been gradual, like the change from afternoon to evening. You don't notice it happening until suddenly you're standing in different light, and everything looks transformed. Margaret had been standing in new light for weeks before she was willing to admit it, even to herself. The invitation to coffee had come from Thomas after a particularly engaging discussion group about the intersection of Renaissance art and modern photography. Margaret had hesitated for only a moment before agreeing, telling herself that colleagues grabbed coffee all the time. This was networking. This was cultivating relationships within the art community. This was absolutely not a date. They'd gone to a small cafe 3 blocks from the gallery, a place with mismatched furniture and local artwork covering every available wall. Thomas had ordered an elaborate espresso drink while Margaret stuck with black coffee, a choice that prompted him to tease her about being old school. She'd laughed, surprised by how comfortable she felt being slightly mocked. It felt affectionate rather than critical, playful rather than mean. That coffee had turned into dinner the following week. Then a visit to another gallery. Then a walk through the botanical gardens where they'd talked about everything except art, discovering that their connection extended far beyond shared aesthetic appreciation. Margaret learned about Thomas's immigrant parents, his pressure to succeed in practical fields, his quiet rebellion through art appreciation. Thomas learned about Margaret's late-blooming career after divorce, her daughter studying abroad, her journey from corporate marketing to gallery ownership. With each meeting, Margaret felt layers of protection she'd built over decades beginning to soften. After her divorce at 31, she'd constructed a fortress around her heart, brick by careful brick. Her ex-husband's affair had taught her that vulnerability led to devastation. Independence had become her religion, self-sufficiency her daily practice. She'd raised her daughter alone, built her business from nothing, and convinced herself that needing no one was the same as being strong. But Thomas was dismantling those walls simply by being present, consistent, and genuinely interested in who she was beneath the competent exterior. He asked about her fears, not just her accomplishments. He wanted to know what kept her awake at night, what dreams she'd abandoned, what regrets still haunted her quiet moments. His questions weren't invasive, they were invitations. Margaret found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone. The panic attacks she'd had during the divorce, the year she'd barely made rent while getting the gallery established. The loneliness that sometimes consumed her in her beautiful, empty house, the fear that she'd sacrificed too much of her life to safety and would wake up at 70 having never truly risked her heart again. Thomas listened without trying to fix or minimize. He didn't offer platitudes or advice. He simply held space for her truth, and in doing so, made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. Her ex-husband had loved her, she supposed, but had never really known her. Thomas was taking the time to understand the complicated, contradictory woman beneath the polished surface. It was during their 6th or 7th meeting, while walking along the river as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, that Thomas had stopped walking and turned to face her. "Margaret," he'd said, her name gentle in his mouth. "I need to be honest about something. These aren't casual hangouts for me. I think about you constantly. I look forward to seeing you with an intensity that's probably alarming. And I know there are 1,000 reasons why this might be complicated, but I have to ask, can I take you to dinner? An actual date with clear romantic intention." The world had seemed to pause in that moment, the river flowing past them like time itself, waiting for her answer. Margaret's first instinct was to list all those reasons for complication. The age gap, the potential judgment, the risk of heartbreak, the comfortable life she'd built that didn't include space for this kind of chaos. But looking at Thomas, at the vulnerability and hope in his expression, she'd found herself saying the most dangerous word in her vocabulary. Yes. That yes had led her here, to this restaurant, to this table, to this moment of possibility that terrified and excited her in equal measure. The walls weren't gone entirely, but they had cracks now, and light was streaming through. The wine arrived, and with it, a loosening of the last remaining tension. Thomas raised his glass in a toast. "Two brave decisions and beautiful company," he offered. Margaret clinked her glass against his, adding, "and to not overthinking everything for at least one evening." They both laughed, acknowledging the mental gymnastics that had brought them to this point. Conversation flowed as naturally as it always had between them, but with an added undercurrent of romantic potential that made everything feel more vivid. Margaret noticed details she'd forced herself to ignore before, the way Thomas's eyes crinkled when he smiled, the elegant movement of his hands when he described something passionate, the way he leaned forward when listening as though he didn't want to miss a single word. They talked about their respective childhoods, discovering unexpected parallels despite the generational gap. Both had been raised by parents who valued achievement over happiness, who had offered financial support but emotional distance. Both had spent their 20s trying to become who their families expected rather than who they actually were. Both had experienced pivotal moments of rebellion that had redirected their lives toward more authentic paths. Thomas described his decision to pursue software development in San Francisco rather than returning to New York to join the family business. It had caused a rift with his father that still hadn't fully healed. Margaret shared her decision to leave corporate marketing to open an art gallery. A choice her then-husband had called reckless and self-indulgent in hindsight. She could see that his resistance to her dreams had been an early warning sign she'd ignored. The food arrived, beautifully plated and largely ignored as their conversation continued. Margaret found herself talking about her daughter Emma with a vulnerability she usually reserved for therapy sessions. The guilt of working so much during Emma's childhood, the pride in her daughter's independence, mixed with the ache of being needed less, the complicated dance of being a mother to an adult child who was finding her own way in the world. Thomas listened with an intensity that made her feel heard rather than judged. He asked thoughtful questions about Emma's interests and plans. And when Margaret worried aloud that the age gap might be weird for her daughter, Thomas gently suggested maybe let Emma decide what's weird for her rather than deciding on her behalf. It was a fair point, delivered without judgment. As dinner progressed, Margaret realized she was laughing more than she had in months. Thomas had a way of finding humor in everyday absurdities, of telling stories that highlighted the ridiculous in the mundane. He recounted a disastrous work presentation where his demonstration software had crashed, forcing him to explain complex algorithms through interpretive dance. Margaret nearly choked on her wine, the image of this sophisticated man flailing around a conference room delightfully absurd. When dessert arrived, a shared chocolate creation that neither had intended to order but both welcomed, they found themselves leaning across the table, the space between them narrowing with each passing moment. Thomas's hand rested near hers on the white tablecloth, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. It would take only the smallest movement to close that gap. Margaret made that movement, her fingers gently touching his. Thomas turned his hand palm up, intertwining their fingers with a tenderness that made her chest tighten. It was such a simple gesture, holding hands across a dinner table, but it felt monumental. It felt like a declaration, like a promise, like a beginning she'd convinced herself would never come. Looking at their joined hands, at the contrast between her skin marked with age spots and his smooth and unmarked, Margaret felt a wave of emotion she couldn't quite name. It wasn't shame about their difference in age, as she'd feared. It was something closer to gratitude. Gratitude that he saw her as she was and wanted her anyway. Gratitude that she'd been brave enough to say yes. Gratitude that love, it seemed, had one more chapter to write in her story. The euphoria of their first date lasted approximately 48 hours before reality came knocking. Margaret had posted a casual photo from the restaurant on her personal Instagram. Nothing obvious. Just a wine glass and a caption about lovely evenings with lovely people. Her daughter had called within an hour, her voice tight with confusion. "Mom, were you on a date? Sarah thought she saw you at Lucia's with some guy who looked like he was my age." The conversation that followed had been one of the most difficult of Margaret's life. Emma wasn't angry, exactly, but she was bewildered and concerned. "I just want to make sure you're being careful," Emma had said, her tone protective in a way that reversed their usual dynamic. "There are people who target older women with money. How well do you really know this person?" Margaret had bristled at older women, even though it was technically accurate, and had defended Thomas perhaps too vehemently. The call had ended awkwardly, with Emma promising to keep an open mind, but clearly worried about her mother's judgment. Margaret had sat in her car afterward, gripping the steering wheel and questioning everything. Was she being reckless? Was this a midlife crisis manifesting as romantic delusion? The doubts she'd suppressed through sheer willpower during the date came flooding back with devastating force. Thomas had sensed something was wrong when they met for coffee the next day. Margaret had intended to keep her composure, to handle this like the mature adult she was supposed to be, but found herself spilling the entire conversation with Emma, along with all her resurfacing insecurities. Maybe this is a mistake, she'd concluded, her voice small. Maybe we're being naive about the complications. What Thomas said next would stay with Margaret forever. Margaret, I'm not naive. I know people will judge. I know your friends might make assumptions about my intentions. I know my parents are going to have opinions, and most of them won't be supportive. But I also know that I've never felt this connected to anyone. I know that age is one factor among hundreds that make you who you are. And I know that I'd rather face complications with you than have simplicity with anyone else. His words had steadied her, but they didn't make the external challenges disappear. Over the following weeks, Margaret encountered the judgment she'd anticipated. A longtime friend had made a comment about boy toys that had ended their lunch early. A colleague at a gallery event had assumed Thomas was her assistant and made a joke about training them young. Even strangers seemed to notice, their eyes traveling between Margaret and Thomas with expressions ranging from curious to condemning. The worst incident came at a fundraising gala Margaret had been planning for months. Thomas had attended as her date, looking impeccable in a tuxedo and charming everyone he spoke with. But Margaret had overheard two board members in the restroom, their voices floating over the stall dividers as they discussed her little crisis and speculated about how long until she came to her senses. She'd stood frozen, humiliation burning through her chest. Thomas had found her shortly after, sitting on a bench in the gallery's sculpture garden, fighting tears. She'd told him what she'd heard, expecting him to be angry or hurt. Instead, he'd sat beside her and said, "Their discomfort says everything about them and nothing about us. They're projecting their own fears and limitations onto our relationship. We don't have to carry their baggage." It was a turning point for Margaret Chireles. She'd been internalizing others' judgments, allowing external voices to drown out her own experience. Yes, she and Thomas had an age gap. Yes, their relationship defied conventional expectations. But they were also happy. They respected each other. They brought joy and growth to each other's lives. Wasn't that what mattered? Driving home that night, with Thomas's jacket around her shoulders and his words echoing in her mind, Margaret made a decision. She would stop apologizing for her happiness. She would stop shrinking herself to make others comfortable, and she would start trusting that she deserved love, regardless of what form it took or what age it arrived. 3 months into their relationship, the time came for the meeting. Margaret had been dreading introducing Thomas to Emma. Her daughter had agreed to fly home for a weekend, with the stated purpose of meeting this Thomas person and determining whether her mother had lost her mind. Margaret had prepared for the weekend like someone preparing for battle, cleaning her house obsessively and planning meals with neurotic precision. Thomas had arrived early on Saturday morning, carrying flowers for both Margaret and Emma, which Margaret found both sweet and perhaps slightly too eager. When Emma's rental car pulled into the driveway, Margaret felt her stomach drop. This was it. The two most important people in her life were about to meet, and the potential for disaster felt enormous. The first hour was excruciating. Emma was polite but distant, asking Thomas questions with the tone of a prosecutor cross-examining a witness. Where did he work? What were his intentions? How had they met? Had he dated older women before? Thomas handled each question with grace, never defensive, always honest. He didn't try to win Emma over with charm. He simply presented himself as he was and trusted that would be enough. The shift came during lunch, when Thomas mentioned he was learning Portuguese because he wanted to read Fernando Pessoa in the original language. Emma, who had minored in comparative literature, lit up. "You know Pessoa?" she'd asked, her suspicion temporarily forgotten. What followed was a 30-minute conversation about poetry, translation, and the impossibility of capturing certain linguistic nuances across languages. Margaret watched, amazed, as her daughter slowly softened. By dinner, Emma was laughing at Thomas's stories and sharing her own experiences studying abroad. Margaret felt tension she'd been carrying for weeks beginning to dissolve. After Thomas left that evening, Emma had sat with her mother on the porch, both of them wrapped in blankets against the cool evening air. "Okay, Emma had said finally. "I get it. He's actually great. And more importantly, you're happier than I've seen you in years." Margaret had cried then, relief and gratitude overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. Emma had hugged her, reversing their usual roles once again. "Mom, you've spent my entire life taking care of me and putting your needs last. If this makes you happy, then I'm happy. Even if it's weird for me to think about my mom dating someone who uses the same slang I do." Meeting Thomas's parents was a different challenge entirely. They invited Margaret and Thomas to dinner at their home in San Francisco, a beautiful Victorian in Pacific Heights that spoke of generations of accumulated wealth. Thomas's mother, Linda, answered the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. His father, Richard, shook Margaret's hand with formal politeness that felt like ice. The evening was a masterclass in subtle hostility. Linda asked about Margaret's daughter in a way that emphasized she had a child old enough to be Thomas's peer. Richard discussed his country club friends whose children were finally settling down with appropriate partners. They asked Margaret about her little gallery, making her successful business sound like a hobby. Every comment was designed to highlight the inappropriateness of the relationship without stating it directly. Thomas, to his credit, pushed back. When his mother mentioned a former girlfriend who was such a lovely girl, so young and full of potential, Thomas had responded, "Margaret is also full of potential, Mom, and has the advantage of having already achieved much of hers." When his father suggested Thomas was going through a phase, Thomas had stated clearly, "This isn't a phase. This is my life, and Margaret is part of it." They left early, the dinner concluding with awkward goodbyes and unspoken tension. In the car, Thomas had apologized profusely. Margaret had taken his hand and said something she'd been learning to believe. "We can't control how people react. We can only control how we show up for each other." The disappointment of his parents' rejection hurt, but it didn't shake the foundation they were building together. That foundation, Margaret was discovering, was stronger than she'd imagined possible. 6 months into their relationship, Margaret and Thomas had settled into a rhythm that felt both exciting and comfortable. They'd stopped worrying quite so much about what others thought and started focusing on what they were building together. Thomas had started keeping clothes at Margaret's house. Margaret had a designated spot in Thomas's apartment. They'd become part of each other's daily routines in a way that felt natural rather than forced. The physical intimacy between them had developed slowly, cautiously, both of them navigating vulnerabilities around age and bodies. Margaret had worried about her aging body, the softness where there had once been firmness, the marks of time that no cream could fully erase. Thomas had been patient, reverent even, treating her body with an appreciation that made her feel beautiful in ways she'd forgotten were possible. What surprised Margaret most was how safe she felt being vulnerable with him. She'd spent decades performing competence, never letting anyone see her uncertainty or need. With Thomas, she could admit when she felt insecure. She could ask for reassurance. She could be less than perfectly strong, and he didn't use that vulnerability against her or see it as weakness. He met her honesty with his own, creating a reciprocity of trust. They'd developed their own traditions. Sunday mornings at the farmer's market, followed by cooking elaborate breakfasts together. Tuesday evening gallery walks, exploring new exhibitions and debating artistic merit over wine. Thursday nights were Thomas's gaming night with friends, space they'd agreed to maintain separate interests. Saturdays were for adventure, day trips to places neither had visited, approaching their relationship with the curiosity of travelers in a new country. Thomas introduced Margaret to aspects of life she'd overlooked or dismissed. He taught her about gaming, not just as entertainment, but as artistic expression and storytelling. He shared his favorite podcasts about technology and philosophy. He brought her into his world of young professionals navigating career, ambition, and work life, balance in ways different from her generation's experience. She found herself learning, growing, seeing familiar things from fresh perspectives. Margaret, in turn, opened doors for Thomas. She introduced him to opera, which he'd assumed he'd hate but found fascinating. She taught him about wine beyond just red or white. She shared lessons from decades of life experience, not as lectures but as stories, letting him draw his own conclusions. She showed him that aging wasn't about decline, but about accumulation of wisdom, resilience, and self-knowledge. They'd had their first serious fight during month 7. An argument about future planning that exposed their different relationship histories. Thomas, who'd never been married, had a more optimistic view of commitment. Margaret, scarred by divorce, approached promises with caution. They'd both said things in anger they regretted, and Margaret had briefly convinced herself that the age gap was finally revealing its fatal flaw. But they'd worked through it, learning to fight fairly, to apologize genuinely, to recognize that disagreement didn't mean disaster. Thomas learned that Margaret's caution wasn't lack of commitment, but protective instinct from past pain. Margaret learned that her trauma from her marriage didn't have to dictate her future. They both learned that love required not just passion, but patience, not just attraction, but active choosing of each other even when it was difficult. By their 9-month anniversary, which they celebrated with a weekend trip to the coast, Margaret realized something profound. She'd stopped thinking of Thomas as her younger boyfriend. He was just Thomas, the person who made her laugh. The person who challenged her assumptions, the person whose presence had become essential to her sense of home. The age gap that had once dominated her thoughts had become just one of many differences between them. No more significant than their different tastes in music or approaches to organization. Standing on the beach at sunset, Thomas's arms around her as waves crashed against the shore. Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in decades: absolute certainty. This was right. This was real. This was love without expiration date or societal permission. This was the kind of love that time couldn't erase because it existed outside of time, in that eternal space where two people simply recognize each other as home. The conversation about the future began casually enough. They were painting Margaret's guest bedroom, transforming it into a home office for Thomas since he'd been working from her place more than his own apartment. As they rolled paint onto walls, discussing furniture arrangement and lighting, Thomas said, "You know, we could save money if I just gave up my lease. I'm here most days anyway." Margaret's hand had paused mid-stroke. Moving in together, it was a logical next step, but it also felt enormous. She'd lived alone for over 20 years, had cultivated a space that was entirely hers. Sharing that space meant compromise, accommodation, the loss of absolute control. It also meant waking up next to Thomas every morning, meant not driving home reluctantly at night, meant building something permanent rather than tentative. They talked about it seriously over the following weeks. Not just the logistics of combining households, but the deeper questions. What did commitment look like for them? Did they want marriage eventually, or was that institution less relevant for a relationship like theirs? How would they handle finances? What about Margaret's retirement plans? What about Thomas's desire to eventually start his own company? These conversations revealed how much they'd both grown. Margaret was learning to trust again, to believe that partnership didn't mean losing herself. Thomas was learning that commitment meant more than romantic gestures, that it involved practical considerations and long-term planning. They were building something sustainable, not just exciting, something that could weather challenges, not just celebrate easy moments. Thomas officially moved in on a rainy Saturday in October, his friends helping transport boxes while Emma, who'd flown in to help, directed traffic with surprising enthusiasm. Margaret watched her daughter joke with Thomas's friends, treating them as peers rather than her mother's boyfriend's social circle. It was a small moment, but it represented so much acceptance and progress. That night, after everyone had left and they'd collapsed exhausted onto the couch, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, Thomas had turned to Margaret with sudden seriousness. "I know we're not doing things in traditional order," he said. "I know people will always have opinions about us, but I need you to know that this, right here, you and me building a life together, This is everything I want. This is forever for me, if you'll have me. Margaret had kissed him then, a kiss that tasted of paint and possibility. Forever is a long time, she'd whispered against his lips. Are you sure you want to sign up for helping me navigate my 60s and 70s? Thomas had laughed. Are you sure you want to tolerate my midlife crisis when it arrives in 20 years? And like that, with humor and honesty, they'd committed to a future that looked different from anything either had imagined, but somehow exactly right. The following months brought continued integration of their lives. They navigated the small conflicts of cohabitation, his tendency to leave cabinet doors open, her obsessive organization system, his night owl schedule, her early bird routine. They learned to compromise, to communicate, to appreciate differences rather than resenting them. They built rituals and rhythms that belonged to them as a couple. Margaret's business continued to flourish, and Thomas's career advanced with a promotion to lead developer. They supported each other's ambitions without competing. When Margaret worried about the gallery's finances, Thomas helped her create better systems. When Thomas stressed about work deadlines, Margaret provided perspective and reminded him to rest. They became each other's champions and safe harbors. On their one-year anniversary, Thomas took Margaret back to the restaurant where they'd had their first date. Over dessert, he pulled out a small box, and Margaret's heart stopped. But inside wasn't a ring. It was a key. This is to the storage unit where I've been keeping supplies, he explained with a grin. I've been secretly taking woodworking classes. I'm building you a custom frame for that painting you love but have never properly displayed. It'll take me months to finish. Which seems appropriate since we're building something that takes time to get right. Margaret had cried. Understanding that this man knew her well enough to realize she'd appreciate a handmade gift more than any diamond. He was investing time, skill, and thought into creating something just for her. That was love. That was commitment. That was the kind of future worth building. 2 years after that first nervous dinner date, Margaret Harrison stood in her gallery during a private event celebrating a new exhibition. Thomas was across the room, discussing contemporary sculpture with Emma and her new girlfriend, the three of them laughing about something Margaret couldn't hear. Even Thomas's mother was there, her acceptance still grudging, but genuine. Having finally realized her son's happiness was more important than her comfort with convention. Margaret's friends circulated through the space. The ones who'd stayed after, proving themselves true by accepting her choices without judgment. This was her life now, full, complex, imperfect, beautiful. Someone asked Margaret once if she ever regretted taking the risk, if the challenges of an unconventional relationship were worth it. She'd thought about it seriously before answering. Yes, there were still difficult moments. People still made assumptions. The age difference would always exist, would become more pronounced with time. There would be future challenges they couldn't yet anticipate. But regret? Never. Because Thomas had given her something she'd thought was lost forever. The courage to be fully alive, to risk heartbreak for the possibility of connection, to trust that she deserved love in whatever form it arrived. That evening, after the last guests left and they locked the gallery doors, Thomas took her hand as they walked to their car. It was a simple gesture, unremarkable to anyone watching, but to Margaret, it represented everything. Love that didn't check calendars or consult actuarial tables. Love that existed because two people decided they could, and chose each other daily, despite every reason the world gave them not to. She'd discovered that the deepest truth about love is this: it doesn't fade with time. It simply waits, patient and persistent, for the moment when we're finally brave enough to let it in. And when we do, when we say yes to love, regardless of its timing or packaging, we discover that some stories don't end.